Greetings, flesh creatures. It is I, Megatron. On behalf of TFYLP, I want to congratulate you for listening to the most refined collected podcast on this miserable little planet Earth. Yes. Here you'll find knowledgeable fans discussing every aspect of Transformers and beyond. Now, enjoy the show while I continue my path to complete conquest of all of you miserable biological entities. Predacons, terrorize!
Hi, and welcome to TFYLP, episode 341, recorded on Sunday, August 11th. And so with me today, I've got Sergio over here. How's it going, Serge?
Good morning.
Got Anna.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you watch this.
And then I've got Jim over here.
Hello, everyone. How you doing? Let us know in the comments.
That's the way to start audience participation early.
We care about our fans, you know.
I
do.
They keep us full.
So today's episode is we're talking about diversity and representation in Transformers. And so this is a topic that Anna had actually presented at TF Expo a few weeks back, that she did a panel on it. And so, you know, we all thought it was great, and we would like to go ahead and bring it to our TFYLP audience as well, for those that couldn't make it to the show. So today's episode is going to, a lot of it's going to be ran by Anna, but then we'll be, you know, jumping in as needed. And then I'm also going to try to run the PowerPoint presentation as a share screen too. So hopefully this works. So
Each of them are allowed to speak once for 10 minutes, but once they use up their speaking token, they can no longer speak. That's the rules. If I was in charge of this podcast, there would be so many inane rules. You guys would all quit. It would be the best thing. I would love it for the 15 minutes before you all revolted. So, do you have are the slides going to show up in the screen, or?
Yeah, do you want me to start with the slides, or?
Oh, you can just put the first one up, and then I can just start talking incessantly.
Okay, all right.
That's what I
yeah,
teach.
just all
right, so I want to start with the fact that I find it funny that you always say we liked it so much that we want Anna to do it on the show, when in fact for both of these panels I've done at TF Expo, you actually did not see it at the time. You actually were not at the panel. So you're just kind of crossing your fingers and hoping, well, I think Anna's competent. It probably went okay.
Well, I know that for the last panel specifically, I know Carrie was there, and she, you know, specifically mentioned how great the panel was. And You've also talked about it with me too, talked about the panel. So it's not like that I have no idea what's going on with the panel.
Oh, no. You don't even know what slide 13 is.
No, it'll be a surprise.
And neither do I, because I haven't looked at this in like 3 weeks. So, yeah, without my joking around. Although I find it useful, like both in classes and on this podcast, to kind of joke around for the first like 10 to 20 minutes while people show up late, because that usually works pretty well. Because I find that I usually don't have a full classroom until like 20 to 30 minutes in, and I usually don't have a full podcast watching room until 20 to 30 minutes in. It's pretty typical.
I can come back if you guys want.
Technically, we also got started like 15 minutes late, though. So
I know. That makes it better. So, yeah, basically the whole idea of this show is so that we talk about something that we don't usually talk about. So once a year at TF Expo, I like to bring in a more, academic topic, something in psychology, because as I've probably mentioned before, my career is in psychology. I'm a professor at an unnamed university, and I teach about psychology stuff. And my specialty area is actually in diversity and inclusion and prejudice and discrimination and those types of things. So I asked to bring in this issue this year because I thought it would be fun to talk about. And it actually went pretty well at the show, and I think it'll go well today as well. Because I really just want to frame this in talking about how we think that the franchise is or is not representative. And the important question that Serge and I were talking about for a minute before the show, should Transformers be representative? Like, why should this particular fandom, this particular franchise actually reflect human diversity? I think that is a good question to ask. So yeah, you can, I think, go to the second slide. See, I told you we need a hand symbol.
Right? No, sorry, I was trying to put a comment on screen as well, so
you just do like a force wave.
I'm a little slow.
Oh, that's okay.
So yeah, I don't know if you can see the screen. Like we're on slide 2 here, so.
Yes, I can see it, but it's funny because there's always a delay, right? So I actually don't see slide 2 yet, which is ironic. So what I'll do is bring it up myself.
I apologize that I don't have it shared in the Skype. I just have it shared on the broadcast.
Oh, and you also have my beautiful formatting. How's that? Okay, so there's a disclaimer page. That is the type of person I am, that there's literally a disclaimer page for our podcast, which is really funny. Just saying that this is not serious. Like, this is serious, but it's not serious. I definitely don't put my professional cred on a show like this because I'm just a fan here, and there's actually been no psychological research on the Transformers fandom that I know of, which is probably both a good thing and a bad thing. Now, feel free to start doing psychological research on the Transformers fandom. That would be great. But I'll be talking about theories from my field, but not actually work on Transformers. Do you have something to say, Lucas? I saw you.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, well, I mean, for that Transformers fan, that actually sounds like a great, project or whatever, like a grad project, right?
Definitely. I'm still waiting to have a student come to me and actually want to do work on the fandom. So far, 0. But probably before I retire, which academics don't retire, so I guess I should say before I die. It might happen once. You never know. You can go to slide 3. And I guess does this just go for the entire podcast? Are we a constant spoiler warning? Because I feel like we just throw out spoilers sometimes, and sometimes we're really good about it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess spoilers. I should have done that just across the top. Right? Spoilers. So.
I just say whatever I want.
That's fair to spoil.
Yeah, but I think a lot of the topics we're going to be spoiling are from G1. There's going to be some stuff from the older IDW comics, I'm assuming, right? But that's been done for over a year. So I mean,
yeah, you've had years.
Who hasn't read this thing, right, Anna?
Right, absolutely. I've read everything that's ever been written in the whole world.
Anyway.
So you can go to slide 4, but Jim, were you going to say something?
I haven't read the really old stuff.
That's fine. I haven't read very much.
You need to get on it.
So if you're on
I would suggest, if you're thinking about getting into the new comics, but you haven't read the old ones, just pretend the old ones are the new ones and buy those instead.
Ah.
How far have you actually read in the new comics before you make your snarky comments, sir?
Issue 6. I have them all. I just, yeah.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought. I've also only read issue 6, but I like it. So that's the difference between us. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about weird stuff. So So in the panel, the first thing I did is I had people think of their favorite Transformer and then imagine them as a person, which, there was that weird G1 episode where everybody got humanized in one way or another. And by everybody, 4 people.
Only human.
Yes. As it says in the slide, funny coincidence.
Oh. I
know.
I love the episode.
So that's what I'm going to start with, and I want everyone to talk about this, but have you ever done this? Have you ever tried to imagine a Transformers character as a person in order to understand them a little bit better?
I don't think I can even pick one favorite. So that's an issue on its own.
Oh my God, Sergio's here. Hi, Sergio.
Good morning, Jim. Yeah, I'm here. I'm just tired. I don't have my coffee yet. But I'm trying to think. You guys are making me trying to think before my coffee. Let's see.
That's all right. That's your job.
I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends on what context favorite. I don't think I have a favorite overall. I have favorites from each series, and I have favorites for different reasons. I guess if we're talking about humanizing, one character in particular that has been humanized very well recently has been Thundercracker. I think he in the recent books has been just outstanding the way that they've humanized him as a character. He was really, I don't want to say turned around, but he's really started to ask himself some questions and start to think to himself whether or not what he's doing is the right thing to do. As far as maybe putting him into diversity, I mean, it really is hard to picture because it's, I don't associate any of these characters other than the ones that have stereotypes, which I guess we'll get into later. I don't really imagine any of these Transformers as color, which I don't know is a good thing or a bad thing. So I don't know. That's a good question, though. If I were to humanize them.
I was going to say, I think the recent IDW comics, I can imagine most of those as humans much more than the original cartoon. And I think, part of that is just the way that, James Roberts did with, the more the meets the eye is that he really kind of gave a human voice and a diverse cast to that book. But yeah, I would have a harder time. I think there's a few characters, and I think, some of the later seasons and stuff, but IDW is a lot easier for me to humanize.
Any thoughts, Jim?
I'm trying to remember the last comic I read. It's been years. I want to say Superion was flying away from a nuke and ended up dying. That might have been Dreamwave. Yeah, I'm behind a little bit.
It doesn't have to be comics, though. It's just
some of the later Dreamwave stuff, even then, yeah.
Yeah.
Even movie characters.
Oh, geez. The movies.
Yeah, we'll get to those.
So the reason I ask is that, I mean, even when the internet was younger and fandom representations online were smaller, if you went to DeviantArt or any other art page or God, what was that? What was that website? Fanfiction.net. I used to go to as a younger adult. Yeah, that was a great place to go. You go to those places, there's fans always trying to talk about human versions of the characters or drawing a human version of a character or cosplaying a human version of a character. Because let's face it, it's a hell of a lot easier than making a giant cardboard or foam suit of a robot. And so therefore there's always this kind of trend in the fandom to be well, if Starscream was a person, how would he look? And that goes from kind of people imagining him as a CD car salesman type character to, my friends who just say that his helmet looks like a hairstyle. So therefore that is how he would look as a person. And I think I find that interesting because it's an attempt for us to relate to the characters. Personally, I think that's what people are doing.
I had never imagined Transformers helmets as hairstyles, but now I can't not do that.
Yeah, sorry. I will ruin your fandom today.
I've seen some really good Transformers cosplays recently. My girlfriend does cosplaying, and she's been toying with Starscream lately, and we've just been like throwing ideas around because we've seen some people do some really cool stuff, and it's always a nice mix of mechanical parts and then with human parts. So that's the look that she's trying to go for. But I've seen some really wonderful stuff. As far as helmets as hair, that's interesting. I haven't seen that before, and I'm very. Send me a picture of that because I really want to see that. It sounds really interesting. Yeah, human I'm sure parts. She would love to see that.
Human parts. That's kind of worrisome.
Well, I think it's interesting. I think Iron Factory is actually coming out with a human version of Starscream, which is that's going to be interesting.
Yeah. It's great. I can't wait for that figure. That's the one Iron Factory figure I'm excited for. Because it's so super weird, right? It's like a girl cosplaying Starscream.
It's a first for Transformers. It's happened before in Gundam where they had the Mecha girls, and so it was only a matter of time until it happened in Transformers, and I'm glad it's happening because it's super cute.
It's super weird, and I love it. You can go to the next one though, because we'll just get started talking about the.
Are we going to the race one?
Yep. That's all right. We're going right there.
Starting off the race. All right.
Yeah, that's all right. Well, because gender was such a talking point in the old IDW stuff, and by old I mean the recently ended line. I didn't want to start there because I knew we would talk the entire time about it if we did. So I wanted to start with race because people pretend that Transformers aren't given human races, but they actually are. And I think Jazz is a good example to start with, because let's just be straight with it. What race is Jazz in G1 or in the movies?
Martini.
He is Car.
To me, I feel like it's really hard to pull human races off as robots, just because it's really easy to start getting into stereotypes. So Jazz is a good example, and then Drift is another one from the movies or whatever too. Where
Drift is the next slide. Don't worry.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Let me get to.
But I do want to talk about Jazz because no one's saying it, but at the panel, I had like 15 people in there, and everyone was just able to agree very quickly that, G1 and movie Jazz, both he is a black man, right? That is what Jazz is. And your reason for it might be a little bit different if you're talking about the like Bayverse movies versus the original series, because the original series, like, I'm going to say it was mostly the voice actor, right? That made people think, I'm relatively well known.
Yeah. And I mean, even his name, because even his name, because Jazz is traditionally stems from black culture, and so you get someone like Scatman to voice it, and I think it's just a great mix. And it's you just hearing the character, you don't even have to see the character. Just hearing the character, or even without knowing Jazz is his name, just hearing Scatman speak the way that he speaks, normally, you can tell that he's putting a lot of character and humanization in his voice work.
Yeah, and the fun thing is, and I like to use Jazz to start because I feel like the depiction, if we start with Jazz in G1, then we go to movie Jazz, then we go to Drift, we go from respectful to racist in a nice scaling way of doing things. It works pretty well. Because honestly, like, I never really, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's just because I'm coming from the perspective of a white woman, but I never really thought of G1 Jazz as being a particularly somewhat stereotypical, but not like disrespectful portrayal of a character. At least not super disrespectful. But then the Bayverse depiction, in a couple ways, I thought was a little disrespectful. Like, not super bad, but just a little bit. Like his entire portrayal is like 6 lines. Like, let's get that straight. He doesn't exactly have a very big part in the movie. But the thing that really stood out to me is that, they try to make him sound and act black in a very short period of time, like get it out there quickly. But then they also gave him, and I said there'd be spoilers, they also gave him the dubious role that the one black guy in action movies usually gets, and that's the first guy to die. Right? Because...
Well, he was the first Autobot to die.
Yeah, it's the first hero to die.
Okay.
In the series and in that movie. And, that's kind of a stereotype in action movies.
I think what's interesting about him, I don't want to say that I'm defending the way that he was portrayed, but to be fair, they did say that they learned how to speak through the internet. If you look on the internet, you're going to find a lot of stereotyping and racism. So, it's not a far-fetched idea that, he ended up in the wrong place on the internet and that's how he learned to speak. He stumbled upon the stereotypes online and that's where he learned to speak. So like I said, I don't want to defend the way that he was portrayed. It's just, I can see, both sides of the coin that, maybe the way that he speaks was just because just how the internet is.
So, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, and I'm kind of veering off topic. So whenever we get done talking about this, I kind of have another point that I want to bring up in general about Transformers.
Okay, got it. Well, I was just going to say that, it kind of goes both ways, right? Because it's, you have an in-universe explanation that Serge just gave, which I find amusing, because I think that's the direction that half the fandom has to go, is that they're not people, they're not humans, so therefore they are in some way appropriating our cultures and using them, in order to better relate to us, and sometimes doing it poorly, and that's kind of an explanation, and maybe that's our excuse for drift here in a minute. But at the same time, I also wonder at it from the other perspective. Is there actually a conscious decision, which I don't really think it's a great conscious decision, to try to put in a little bit of racial diversity in the character list? If we have an action movie military team like the first movie did, should we make sure that one of them is a racial minority? Which I think is an interesting... I don't know. I feel like that decision was still made. I feel like that decision was definitely made there, an attempt to be representative, quote unquote, in the way that we usually do it in movies, which is throw in one person, which that's not actually great, but it's something.
So
you want to be our topic?
I wanted to make is I think that a better way for Transformers to handle this type of thing is really more talking about an allegory, not human race, but more races of Transformers and how that defines them. And so then, or their alt modes. So when you talk about in the comics, it's like this, where they had the functionalists and whatnot. And
slide 9 real quick, Lucas. So it's just slide 9 because that's the topic there. No, it's fine. I just want to have that up in the background.
Okay, slide 9, robot approach. Yeah, so I think that to me is the way that they can do it. And even with shows like Rescue Bots, where that I think there were some episodes with that where they kind of does the fact that Heatwave is a fire truck define him as a character or whatever, type of thing. And so that's to where I think that it's better, because then that way you're not trying to hit someone over the head with some type of racial stereotype to be this is this race, this is this race, whatever, and shoehorn it in, but you still have that same allegory to where you have, different diverse Cybertronian races that have to kind of work together. And you also have persecution because of that, because you're oh, well, you're just in the in the Transformers comics, they literally have robots that are made to be throwaways, and so that's kind of something to where you can kind of touch on the fact that, the ruling race or whatever is oppressing the other races.
Right. And that's one approach that I think, people often would rather that the people who write Transformers take that approach, because it's more respectful in a lot of ways. I think you're definitely right. But the thing I want to point out is, even if you look at mainstream portrayals of fantasy races, if you look at portrayals of elves and dwarfs and orcs and all those types of things, your classic Tolkien races, they always end up being heavily modeled on human nationalities and races. And I feel like if you made an animated version of IDW World, you would end up with a similar thing. I think a certain group of robots would be given a certain accent or way of speaking. They would be modeled after people, which is always interesting to me.
Yeah, Transformatics in the comments said, I've heard some white folks sound more black than some black folks, and vice versa. This is why I never try to imagine the robots as people, because they're not, and race should not factor.
Right, and that's I think that's the idea that we're putting out right now, is that really race is built into Transformers. It's just, it's not our race. It's different race. I put down mini-cons and headmasters. Were you guys say something, Serge?
Oh, yeah. No, he brought up, that's a good point of, it's tough to really put color to a Transformer. It's a little bit easier with video games and other kind of stuff because, usually you can see the character is human, or at least more human than a robot. For example, I was going to use Kratos as an example from the God of War series, because I know there was some small controversy about how he is voiced by a black voice actor, but he was portrayed as a very, very pasty white character. And well, the reasoning was, basically the reason is that he's pasty is because of, his storyline, which I'm not going to get into. But what I was getting at was, with him, I didn't even know that he was voiced by a black voice actor until I actually looked it up. So I think especially with Transformers, unless you start to dig to see who's voice acting for these characters, unless it's a character like Jazz, how we mentioned, has some stereotypes and some, defining features, it's really tough for me to place a race on a character unless they have certain features.
Certain features. Go back to slide 7, Lucas, for certain features.
Is that...
That's the drift slide.
7?
Yeah.
What's that? The one I'm on?
That's the drift slide. Yeah.
Oh, the drift one, yes. Okay.
Yeah. Because that's what happens, right? I feel like, because I have a picture of Drift from the movies, which if anyone, just in case someone's listening instead of watching, and Drift from the movies is, his robot mode is some sort of samurai looking thing, right? Very stereotypical samurai motif, not really updated or modernized in any way. Oh, one slide back, Lucas, because you're on the Representation Matter slide. The drift slide.
No, I'm on the drift
slide. Okay.
Yeah, it's just...
there's just such a delay in the stream. Anyway, because that's what happens, right? We end up with something I don't know, I have to be honest, I have talked to a lot of people about movie drifts and how much I hate movie drifts, and the first time he showed up in a movie, I actually had all my friends go with me to watch it. It was this special, we're going to go watch an Anna movie because we're going to be nice to her thing, and all my friends who don't really like Transformers, and they were like, oh my god, what is this? They did not like Drift. Oh.
Yeah, Drift is, ooh, I can't wait to get into him. Very interesting.
Yeah, and we can get into him now. I think it is very interesting. And I have to admit, before we get into this topic, I have never actually discussed the portrayal of Drift with a Japanese person. I actually haven't. I wish I had, because I would like to hear how offensive he is.
Yeah.
Or not.
Mm-hmm. And it's... well, the Bay movies are no stranger to very, how could I say, eccentric stereotypes. Drift is a good example of what not to do. Because, well, I'll give them this. They at least got a Japanese man to voice him. They at least did that. It would have been way worse if they got a white guy to go into the booth and start recording very heavy accent, which, I mean, I don't know what they did to convince Ken Watanabe to do that, because he speaks very well English. His English is very well. If you hear him speak, his accent is not that excessive as it was in the movies. He speaks really good English. So they had to have told him, like, hey, can you just, like bump up the accent there. As far as the robot mode, I have mostly issues with the way that he was portrayed, the way he spoke. The way he looked, not so much, because the character of Drift, I mean, his character, if you know his character, he is very interested in Japanese culture, and he studied in Japan. That's how his fighting style is, traditional Japanese fighting. So that's okay, because I think when the what we were talking about earlier about using, or I guess the method of what was that one slide we talked about where the robot method,
right? Showing, robot races instead of human races.
So I think him looking as a samurai wasn't so much disrespectful, just because, that's, when you look at the samurai armor, that's something that you automatically think that's traditional Japanese culture. It can be viewed, I can see where some people, obviously I don't want to speak on behalf of Japanese people, but I personally don't think that him being modeled after a samurai is bad per se. That's just my opinion. Where the issue was with me was just the way that he spoke. It was very, very stereotypical, the wise Asian man with a very heavy Japanese accent. His interaction with the other Autobots, he was, kind of, it's hard to explain. It's just not very well done, is what I'm trying to get at. Just because, and I don't even want to get into the twins. I don't know if we will get into the twins later on. But, and especially because I was also going to mention this. I have no idea why they made him a Bugatti in the movie. It would have made a lot more sense if they chose a Japanese car. I know it's probably because of money, It was whichever car company.
The sponsorship, right?
Yeah, I guess it was whichever car company gave him the most money. Because I always thought that it was weird that, this samurai who has a very heavy Japanese accent turns into a French supercar, which I thought was weird. I was like, okay, weird. Because in the comics, he turns into this Japanese style vehicle mode, which I thought was great because, as a person who is really into car culture, some people may view that as a stereotype, but not really, because the type of car that he turns into in the comics and the Generations toy stems from Japanese culture. Those types of cars and modifications came straight from Japan. So that's why I liked his toy a lot more, was because, I like Transformers that turn into cars that I like. So that was really cool to see, that he had the big wing and the cool body kit and the vinyl decals and all that kind of stuff. Because I have, my car's Japanese, so I have a bunch of Japanese decals on it and stuff. So it was really cool to relate to, because it was just something personal. But yeah, movie Drift, no bueno. I don't like him. I really do not like him, and I'm trying not to remember the last night. Did he pop up in the last night for more than like 10 seconds?
I don't know if it was more than 10 seconds that he was there.
A bit, yeah. But I think the focus as far as that goes was more on Hot Rod.
Oh yeah, he was another one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was very stereotypical, but I agree with what Anna says. I really would like to discuss with a Japanese fan, because I know if it's always interesting discussing to see what they feel about being represented that way, because I know traditionally in American culture, the way that they have Western culture represents Eastern culture is not very well done.
You know, well done.
Yeah, no. I mean, well, the way Western culture represents anything is not very well done. But that is one of the ones that comes to mind where it's like, they mishandled that very wrong. And I'm more surprised that the movie came out in 2014. I'm really surprised that no one was like, hey, do you really think that this is a good idea? You know, like, I was surprised that something came out that recent where, you know, they went that far with it. And I guess with the movies being universally hated by people who aren't Transformer fans, well, even with Transformers fans, I think that helped with it not catching as much flack from that. Because I remember the twins caught way more flack than Drift did.
Absolutely. So, way more flack.
Yeah.
They were more straight negative, though. Like, he wasn't portrayed as incompetent or bad or disliked by his peers. They were portrayed as everything bad. Mm-hmm. But it's just for sake of maybe a little bit faster. Go to the next slide, please, Lucas. The slide that says, why does representation matter? Because I put in 2 whole slides, so it's going to be a total of like 6 minutes where I actually talk about psychological theory and try to explain why I think this conversation is so important. And, you know, the thing I want to say about this particular part of the topic, about talking about bringing in representations of people's races. So slide 8's where I want you to be. The one that says, why does representation matter?
Yep. Okay. It's on there.
Cool. I know the delay. It's making me feel crazy. So just to like put it out there, there's a good amount of research about why representation of one's own race and one's own identity actually makes them feel better, more positive, more represented, better self-esteem, those types of things. And one thing to put out there is that, like, I talk to the other hosts of TFYLP quite a bit, and these guys and myself all think about and absorb Transformers a lot. We spend a lot of time with this media, and a lot of, you know, big fans of any particular fandom spend a lot of time with it. That means that, you know, the fiction you're absorbing, the ideas you're thinking of, the stories you're thinking of are coming from this particular fandom. So if there's no representation of you in it, you're not actually seeing that as often. Now, I know for many of you, you know, you have other things you watch as well, which might be, you know, humans instead of robots, or maybe you only watch robot things. Which I think is me half the time. But it is important to have that out there because there's a lot of research out there showing that, you know, we have like perceptual preference of our own race. We better recognize and process people of our own race. And the idea that a person can possess bias against other races, unfortunately transcends one's own race. So, you know, research suggests that people actually have implicit bias against their own race, like automatic negative feelings towards their own race when their race is negatively stereotyped. And the only way to actually work on that is to change cultural representations. So the only representation of your race in your favorite fandom is super racist depictions of the movies, then you're just reinforcing those negative stereotypes, which sucks. And, you know, the last thing on the slides was just mentioning what I call the infamous doll studies, because they don't replicate very well and they're very old. But there were those old studies you guys have probably heard about, being toy fans, where they gave black and white children various baby dolls. Yes. And they showed that the black children even had preference for the white dolls. Those studies don't replicate very well in modern times, and there's very mixed results. So there's no, like, I don't really want to discuss it too much, but it's just kind of mixed evidence. And there is quite a bit of evidence that, you know, bad representation of your race has negative consequences. So, I mean, I feel like the best way to do it is either respectful depictions of race, which we had a whole one example from the fandom, or not depicting human races, one or the other, in order to do that. But I'm happy to hear other perspectives from people as well. I think that's the direction we're going in general in our conversation.
Well, I mentioned before the show about representation and about how I ironically don't want representation in Transformers because I don't want humans in Transformers. But the more we talk about the topic, the more I realized, you know, I meant that more in a joking fashion. Obviously, now that we've spoken more on the topic, representation as far as within the robot characters themselves is very important because, as you mentioned, when you're looking at your favorite fandom or your favorite show or whatever, you actively look for those type of things. And so if you get portrayed negatively, you're going to take that, to heart. Thankfully, I haven't had that so far in Transformers. The only one I can think of is we've had maybe two that I can think of. Correct me if I'm wrong. I know in Armada, we had a Hispanic character named Carlos, who they didn't really touch too much upon him being a Hispanic character. They kind of just treated him as another character, which was great, but you can tell that I think he was voiced by a Hispanic voice actor too, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. I'd have to look it up. But he didn't have any stereotypes that I remember off the top of my head. It was just, his name was Carlos. He was brown, and I liked him because he was brown, and I was brown. In the movies, we had Isabella, who was portrayed. She was portrayed by a Hispanic actress, and she was done okay. I didn't like Squeaks. I didn't like how, because he was with a Hispanic character, he could only say Chihuahua, which I thought was kind of, I don't want to say it was more racist. It was just kind of like really, it was more one of those things like, come on, really? Like that's, but her as a character, I can't think of any negatives. I know she threw in some Spanish words in the movie, which Spanglish is very present in our culture, especially with modern Hispanics. With modern Latinos, we love to do Spanglish. With my parents, I always do a mix of both. With my girlfriend, I always do a mix of both. With my family, I do a mix of both. Sometimes I'll do just Spanish. Sometimes I'll do just English. But her doing Spanglish was a thumbs up for me because that really does portray young Latinos well, because that is how we speak. We speak with each other with a lot of Spanglish, especially since the character was from Texas too. I think so.
Not sure.
I just know. I know she was just from the Southwest U.S., which is very heavy Hispanic population. I think she was handled. I don't want to say well, but she wasn't stereotyped to hell. Yeah, is basically what I'm getting to.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me. Oh, sorry, go on, Jim.
I was just going to briefly mention to follow up on what Serge said. Carlos Lopez in Transformers Armada was voiced by Matt Hill in the English dub. He was a Canadian voice actor.
Okay, so
just looking at his picture, I don't believe he's Latino.
Okay, so he wasn't. Okay, so he did have a slight accent in the show. So I guess that is the one fault that they did have, was it is kind of disrespectful when you have one person playing another race, especially nowadays. That's one of the biggest topics, is whitewashing characters. Having a non-white character being voiced by a white character. So that's something that I guess Transformers could work on. But like I said, other than those two characters that I can think of, I can't really think of any other examples of where Hispanic characters have been in Transformers.
What about Transformers Generation 1? I'm thinking of, what was his name? Raul?
Yeah.
Hung around with Trax?
Yep.
Yeah, Raul. Yeah. I didn't watch much of G1, so I can't really speak on it. So I don't know.
It's never too late to catch up.
Yeah. I don't know what your guys' opinions on him as a character are. I'm curious to see.
Well, I think in general that I enjoy if there is diversity among the human characters. Like, I think that it's for the robots, I think if you have certain ones where you're just not hitting you over the head with whatever that race is, I think it's fine, and try to get a diversity of the cast of the voice actors and whatever. But I think that a lot of times I think you can hit that racial diversity by having the human characters be, diverse races. But I think at the same time, that you may bring up some, various issues, but throwing it in there is like not like hitting you over the head, but just something so it's there. So like it seems like it's normal, if that makes sense. So like what you were saying, Serge, about the Spanglish stuff, right? It's something to where that you may, I may not even necessarily like noticed or really even thought about, but it was something that's important to you. So like that's where I think that they should hit for both for the movies and whatever cartoons they're doing.
Yeah, and it's small stuff like that sticks out when you're represented, because like I mentioned, that's something that we as a culture do, whereas representing characters using stereotypes, that's the wrong way to do it. Because some people could argue that certain things that we as a culture do can be viewed as stereotypes, but stereotypes stem from negativity, whereas, so like if they were to have Isabella dressed up, with a sombrero or something, then that would have been not okay. But with the Spanglish stuff, that was like something nice that they threw in that I enjoyed.
And I think you get to a really good point that we definitely don't have a time for, but it's actually the difference between good representation and just like kind of throwing things in, which is something I'm going to bring up in just a second. But the idea that when I think back, you asked like Serge said, I wanted to see what you guys thought of Raoul. And to be honest, I watched She-One as a kid. I watched She-One a lot as a kid. I tried to catch it every time it was on TV. I tried to see it as often as I could. But then I didn't go back and actually rewatch any of it or actually try to like relive any of it until, like maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, not too long ago. Probably actually more like 10 years ago, which is probably when the movies were really starting to come out. But honestly, I didn't remember Raoul. I didn't even remember Carly, actually, because those characters were there, but they weren't there that much. And, single episodes or just a few episodes didn't really make that big of an impact on me as a kid. Actually, having a character who is long-term part of the story is what would really make an impact more. So I don't think I even really, it's kind of, and I'm going to go into this point as well, but, we had like one episode with female Autobots that did not make me remember female Autobots very well. It was kind of like, oh, they were there? Oh, yeah, that's right. Kind of thing. I did remember them a little bit better, but that's the else as well. But if you go to slide 11, Lucas, we're going to just talk about gender for a second, just so I can make another point before we finish up, because I think we'll make good time to get done in about 60 minutes. I just want to talk about, the mixed history of usage of gender in Transformers. It has been interesting. And yeah, I don't think I want to get super deep into it because I want to talk more about representation than just how the fandom sucks with gender. But if you just look at just G1RZ, you see like her portrayals were really mixed on whether they were good portrayals or bad portrayals of the only woman character in the robots. Because even though there were the other female Autobots in the past, once she showed up, she was it, right? She was the one, and she showed up more frequently after she was introduced, but she was the one character. And in the movie, she was portrayed basically as a robot version of Princess Leia, which is a decent female portrayal. People like her as a character, Leia, not RC. And it was decent. But then after the movie, in the cartoon, she became a minor supporting character. In even later series, she kind of became this person who operated computers and kind of looked like an administrative assistant in the background and was no longer a major character at all. And then, she makes an appearance as some sort of strange headmaster mom, and she's kind of gone from the fandom. So what I mean is that her representation went from like a major character who had some level of actual control over the situation, some level of actual portrayal of being a person that matters, to a smaller and smaller role that you usually see, you know, females in action series, especially 80s cartoons that were directed at boys. Just kind of got worse and worse as time went on.
So, you know, here's my question just in general, because I know that, you know, a lot of it stems from the fact that, you know, this was a boys' cartoon, and, you know, the boys aren't going to want to buy the female characters because they don't relate to those characters and yada, yada, right? So, you know, I know that historically we've always had it where that toys in general, that you have this huge split, right? You have one aisle of girls' toys and you have the rest of it is boys' toys or whatever, right? So, like, why is that? Like, why do they do that? And why can't they just, because to me, I would almost think that it would make more sense to mix it all together and then like sell part of the line, you know, be girls' toys and part of the line be boys, because then that way they could just make the same stuff. They only need one cartoon that, you know, both genders are watching, you know, right? But like now, like it is a good example, like the DC, like they came up with a DC cartoon and toy line that was all girls, and like they literally really, I can't remember what the name of the show or toy line was called, but I just remember seeing end caps.
DC Superheroes, wasn't it?
Yeah. And so it's like,
great name.
Why not just, like, you know, combine that together rather than, you know, making something that's like super girly.
That stems in from institutional sexism of us as a society. We have set boys have to like this, girls have to like this. So it stems from that being ingrained into our society for so long that, you know, that extends to the stuff that we purchase. Now, more recently, I know Target, I don't know if Target's the only one or the first one. I know that they had a big controversy when they actually got rid of signs that said boys' toys. They got rid of signs that said girls' toys, and now it just says toys. Like, you know, they have that when you look at like the directional arrows of which department is which in which area, the arrows will just say toys now instead of saying, you know, boys' toys are this way, girls' toys are this way. And now they switched over to just having toys or the signs of the toy line themselves. So more recently from that, just we as a culture have really started to, you know, more start to call out toxic masculinity of where, you know, boys are only allowed to like these things. Now it's more, you know, it's okay for a girl to like Marvel. It's okay for a girl to like Star Wars. It's okay for a boy to like Barbies. It's okay for, you know, it's okay for a boy to like pink. You know, just me as a personal example, because my parents are first generation immigrants. I was the first generation to be born here. My parents immigrated here. And so their cultural views are still very masculine. And so when I very first started wearing a lot of pink, because pink is my favorite color, my mom questioned it, because that's just what she grew up with and what her culture is, a very masculine culture. You know, she her in Hispanic culture, that's a thing that we need to get really over, where, you know, it's still today, it's very masculine, where my mom will still say, you know, men don't belong in the kitchen, that's where women belong. So that's like a whole nother topic for another day. But
she
but
should
basically,
be Gordon Ramsay.
Yeah, she cooks very well. But yeah, as far as you would think that it makes sense that, you know, well, why don't they just make one universal toy line that appeals to both genders, or, well, I'm sorry, every gender. It's more than that. I mean, you know, like you mentioned, now there are more toy lines that have started to appeal to all genders instead of just the traditional two. But we still have remnants of, you know, of separate lines that are obviously meant for, you know, boys and girls. Right. But I think the more as we progress and the more we start to talk about gender and sexuality, the more that line is blurred. Because definitely now, even with non-binary and more people starting to identify as neither, or basically it's kind of derailed a little bit because I have a bunch of thoughts in my head that I'm trying to all form into one sentence. But especially with, as I mentioned earlier, toxic masculinity, nowadays, I lost my train of thought again. It's basically defining gender is very tough to do. And so when it comes to, you know, boys can only like a certain things, girls can only like a certain things. Nowadays, it's when we're speaking about toxic masculinity, it's not so much that, you know, boys aren't allowed to like traditional masculine things like fishing and cars and, you know, hunting and all that kind of stuff. It's more of, it's okay to like that stuff, but it's not okay when you tell people that that's only what they should like, is what I'm trying to get to. And that extends to toys, where it's okay if a boy likes traditionally masculine things like Hot Wheels, Star Wars, Marvel. It's okay for them to like that. But what it's not okay is when people start saying that just because you're not a boy, you can't buy those things or you can't enjoy those things. Right. Well, that's where it starts to get in the negative.
And that's the thing, like, I know, you know, with me that, like, we were at McDonald's one day and my kids, they had My Little Pony, and they had, I can't remember what the boys' toy was, right? But my kids, like, were like, oh, that looks cool, like, and that's what they wanted. So they went up and, like, when they ordered it, they said that they wanted the pony thing, right? And the person working at the counter was like, oh, why would you want that? That's supposed to be for the girl. And I'm like, look, if my kid wants a pony, he gets a freaking pony. I don't care, like, you know, what, you know, whatever. Like, it's so. That's the thing. I think some of those types of things that it's like, and I know, like, My Little Pony is something that a lot of, it has been a big thing that a lot of kids or boys or whatever have really, like, you know, kind of enjoyed that show and enjoyed that. So that, you know, that's the thing is that to me, and I don't know, I mean, who knows, like, you know, toys I know are kind of going by the wayside for kids, but for the most part, but, you know, hopefully we can kind of continue to see that line blurred to where it doesn't really matter what toys, you know, if the kid wants a you know, a girl's toy or a boy's toy, it's like, it's all the same.
Yeah, because all that stuff is taught, like you said, with your children as an example, wanting a specific toy, but then being told no by another person. All that stuff is taught. Kids don't really have a sense of gender until we as adults put it in them. You know, if you just, you know, give a kid, you know, like, I don't know where I'm trying to get to this. If you don't tell a child that what is for boys and what is for girls, they're not going to know, you know, unless you specifically tell them that you have to wear the color blue because you're a man, you can't wear pink. If you don't tell them that, they're not going to know. They're just, because gender is really a social construct. There really is no way to define it. Gender is how we as a society define it. And so that's, you know, my response to what you said with your kids. I hope that you let them get the toys, right?
Oh, no, yeah, no, absolutely. Like, I told the person, you know, this is what we want, that, and they gave that, you know, to them. So, yeah, and like, we do that too, because a lot of times, like, my kids, like, when we go and buy toys for like a birthday party or something like that, and they'll, you know, we usually don't go down the girls' aisle, but then they'll be buying it for a girl in their class, and they're like, oh, this is cool, like, I want this or I want that, and so we'll end up getting, you know, certain items or whatever, because I'm, you know, it's like, I don't care, whatever toy that they want, then, you know, like, I'm not going to necessarily say, no, you can't get this toy.
Your kids definitely have plenty of cute toys, I will say. They don't lack for the cute toys as opposed to the cool and masculine toys, which is good. That's good for them. And Serge, I really appreciate you going on the gender rant for me, so I didn't have to. That's why I was smiling a lot as you were talking, because I was like, this is like the stuff I say in class. This is handy.
Yeah, because this is all topics that I've, you know, recently, I'm a recent graduate, so this is a lot of stuff that we talked about in class, as well as my fellow peers, or stuff that I talked to with my girlfriend, because, you know, she's part, while she does identify as binary female, she is part of LGBTQ. So it's just a lot of stuff like that. We always get into some really interesting conversations because it's, while I identify myself as straight, she doesn't. So it's always interesting to kind of see the conversations we have of, her opinions on certain things versus my opinion on certain things. And then getting back to, Transformers, how we were talking about gendered toys. I'm really glad that Transformers has gone from, very masculine to, we only have male characters. Now we're getting a lot more female characters. We got our first female combiner. We're finally finishing out all the G1 female characters. I've noticed a lot within the fandom, there's a lot more representation for not just males. And it's very, especially with the books, because I noticed that when the books came out, the IDW books, that's when it really exploded, that we started to see a lot more non-male fans, was because finally, especially with the books representing the LGBTQ within Transformers, which I never thought could be done, because while yes, the Transformers characters do have traditionally male or female characteristics, I just viewed them as robots. So I never really assigned a gender to them, even though they had gender traits. The way that the books did it was great. And so I think it's really cool now that we're starting to see a lot more non-male fans. And I think Transformers as a whole, as a fandom, we have become very diversified. And even on top of that, I'm very proud of us as a fandom as being very welcoming. I have never felt as an outsider for being non-white. I have never been made fun of my race. I've never felt discriminated against within the fandom. While I can't speak for others, I certainly hope that you've never experienced that. At least for personal experience, I can say that I felt very welcome within the fandom.
Yeah, I'll say mostly. We'll get to that in a second. But just to circle back real quick to what Lucas said about the toy section thing, I think it's going to take a long time for all the reasons the Surge said about institutionalized sexism before we really fix that problem. Because if you look at the rest of the store is just as gender segregated as the toy section is. From the clothes section to even grocery, food that is stereotypically bought by men is all together. Food that is stereotypically bought by women is put all together. Things are marketed to one gender or another and then segregated all throughout the store. So it's not just the toy section. It's our culture. Our culture has always been in love with the gender line. Like, we really like to split things one way or another. There's a store that's targeted to men, store that's targeted to women, section targeted to men, section targeted to women. And while that is changing as younger people make decisions and have a more, diverse perspective on gender and gender roles, it's changing very slowly, which is, the way change typically goes.
So the one thing that I think is cool, and I had talked about, I know you had said that, the G1 cartoon, right? That they have, RC was the main, female. There was like one episode with, a bunch of other females, but outside of that, they, weren't really represented. And then I was bringing up, because I was looking on the newest Transformers cartoon, which is Cyberverse, that if you look at that, there's like over half a dozen female characters in that cartoon. And I think that they've pretty much put all of the historical, characters from, the Windblade that was created. I think Slipstream's in there. I think, was I saying, was it Strika? Which was the...
It's a version of Shatter, right? It's like Shatter something, maybe.
Yeah. But there's quite a few, and they're different modes. Like, it's not like it's just one, that they're planes or whatever, that they're in there. And so I think that that's, really neat too. And again, my point, getting back again, that it's not like that they're hitting you over the head with it. It's just that there's female voices like on the show as well. And so then that way it's almost seems like it's more normal, to where there's like more of a split, that you're not hearing all these, guys or whatever, voices on the show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The major point I want to make, because we're not just talking about, gender and race and Transformers, but representation itself, is that while representation has been something that's been attempted since RC, it's been something that's been attempted very poorly. So the slides you have up right now, I think makes the point very well. Throughout time, gender in Transformers has been non-existent because originally the original Marvel Comics run and most of the G1 episodes had no Transformer gender. You know, there was one female Autobots episode, but otherwise it was just two robots fighting each other. And the comics didn't really add gender in. But then in other series, like with RC, and then when Beast Wars comes out, we got Black Arachnia and Airazor. Suddenly gender was existent, but very rare. And then in later series, like in Animated and Prime, you have gender is apparently a thing, like it's apparently relatively commonplace, but most of the female characters are still very minor, right? They're not major players. They're still the minor side characters. So what that means is that we're getting women in the series, but we're representing them as minor characters, as rare characters, as less important characters, which is not the best thing in the world. What were you going to say, Jim?
Should we count Sorry Sumdac in that? I mean, we had the spoiler warning earlier in the episode. So
we did.
If Sorry Sumdac would qualify. For those that haven't seen Animated, spoilers, sorry. She's a mom.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean,
but she's mostly used as a human character through most of the series.
Yeah, until she discovers that she's not.
Right. But I don't think that retroactive representation works. Like, I've talked to people about this many times, but like, if you've had a friend your whole life who was secretly, and I always use this example because most people don't know many Wiccans, but who was secretly Wiccan, and you've been friends with them for like 20 years, and then like eventually they're like, actually I'm a practicing Wiccan, it's my religion, blah, blah, blah. That doesn't mean you suddenly like Wiccans. That doesn't mean you're suddenly comfortable around Wicca. That doesn't mean that you're suddenly knowledgeable about Wicca. You still only know that person as an individual. So I don't really think that counteractive representation works like that. And even like the people who say, like once they started portraying female characters in the IDW comics after Windblade and everybody started showing up, a lot of fans want to go back and say, well, there's no voice acting, so, this Transformer or that Transformer was always female. They always had a female voice, they always had a female characterization. But that doesn't really work as far as representation goes, to be like, we're going to retroactively say this character was a member of the unrepresented group. If you go to the next slide, Lucas, the only other academic point I wanted to make today was the concept of relative invisibility, which is the concept we talk about sometimes in psychology, and that's the idea that your group isn't completely unrepresented, which most racial groups and most groups in general are totally unrepresented in Transformers, but it's the idea that your group isn't entirely unrepresented. It's just that it's represented by a small group or an inaccurate group. So this is when you only have the because Black Arachnia, by the time Beast Machines came around, I really liked her as a character. But then again, she was the only major character, good guy-ish female character that I had to relate to anyway. But she was also hypersexualized.
I wanted to mention that too, where Black Arachnia has traditionally been very sexualized, in both her design and the way that she's portrayed as a character. In multiple shows, they usually show her as this seductress that uses her femininity as a tool to get what she wants, or to manipulate the male robots into getting to her ultimate goal, I guess. I agree that she was always very hypersexualized, especially in the figures as well too.
Yeah, because her Transformer toy was the first sexualized Transformer toy we had. I remember, because I was pretty young when that toy came out, but I hung out with other Transformers fans in my area who happened to be 30-ish men, and they were very excited about the toy for reasons that as a very young child I didn't really fully understand. why they were so excited about the toy and to look at it. But it was the first time there was really a sexualized woman transformer toy that was available at retail that sold very quickly.
Wasn't it just a repaint of Tarantulas, though?
Her original
the Transmetals,
toy,
no.
but the Transmetal actually,
Transmetal.
like it was the first time they basically molded her boob plate and all of that stuff to make her look very feminine.
And then
if
what
we
was
had
it
more,
that came out just a couple of years ago from Takara? Was it Legends or something?
Yeah, the Legends.
Or they remolded the mandibles or whatever.
Yeah, the mandibles in her robot mode were like a bra.
Yeah.
Yep.
Which, if we had more time, I would love to touch upon that subject. I think that makes for another great topic for another day, is the sexualization within Transformers toys.
Robot toys.
Yeah, because I mean, look at the recent third-party stuff. Man, there's a lot to talk about.
Oh yeah,
those third-party RC stuff.
The big Firebird.
And figures. Yeah, and figures. Not just the add-on kit that shall not be named, but that was definitely when I first saw that. Oof. But
there's
full figures.
A whole line of sexualized female figures coming our way, which is really weird.
Yeah, it is very weird.
What I wanted to say about this part of the topic is just when you have representation that sucks, when you have representation that isn't right for the group, it doesn't actually work very well for the group that's being represented. So, like, even throwing in just RC early on in the IDW comics and making her a malicious, crazy murder hobo, that was not so great, because not only did you have that horrible background where gender was inflicted on her as a form of torture, but you also had, her as a cold-blooded killer who didn't really feel very positive herself as the only female character that you were given in the comic, which is not so great. And, I talked last year on the podcast and in the panel, if you go to slide 16, the idea of parasocial relationships with TV and media characters. That's basically just to simplify it into two sentences. That's just the fact that we form relationships that are one-sided with media characters we like. So we really know them, we really care about them, and we really invest in them, but they don't know us. And one important part of that is that those relationships can actually make us feel good. They can make us feel positive. They can make us feel better. But we're most likely to form relationships with those characters that we can actually relate to. So if you want to actually feel positive towards a character, that's more likely to happen if they actually represent you, if they actually share things in common with you. So getting excited about the one female character, getting excited about the one brown character, that's something we want to be able to do. But when that character sucks, when that character is someone that you absolutely can't relate to, it does not work as well.
So I think overall the takeaway from much of this would be that representation is super important, so long as it is not representation just to fit in with some kind of criteria, but that actually reflects better. How am I trying to say this? That's not degrading or tears down, but instead representation that is positive and inclusive.
And some measure of diversity within groups as well. Like one thing that one person in the audience said when I gave this panel a few weeks ago that I thought was really good. We were talking about, and how much I hate it, even though I think they do display pretty well, the new female Autobots set where they're all the same deluxe mold and they're all skinny backpack women. One of the people in the audience, when I made that joke, said, here I am. I have a bunch of female characters, a bunch of female figures, and none of them look like me.
Yeah.
And that is a really good point, because just because you throw in one girl or one stereotype of a girl doesn't mean that you're representing all women. Right. Very much not representing all women. By the time IDW finished, they did a pretty good job of having diverse male and female characters. but it took a long time to build that. And that's why I'm actually kind of glad they rebooted in some ways, because they can start with that level of inclusion early on.
Or like you guys were saying earlier with the movies with Jazz, it's like, sure, they included him, but did they include him because they wanted to have a certain token character to fit in with that stereotype, or did they want to include him just to be part of the crew, just another Autobot soldier?
Yeah. No, there's ways to do it right and there's ways to do it wrong. And I think the main point I want to make is, if you're going to do representation, inclusion, try to do it in a good way and try to actually consult people that would be affected by it. And for the right reasons. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. But
you have to have that genuine intent behind it, not just a superficial inclusion.
I know that some people complained about bringing in a woman to write the first, inclusion of Windblade into the fiction. Some people are like, "Oh, this is obviously heavy-handed." People that are fandom complain about everything. But I thought it was great because you found a better portrayal of female voices, right? A woman writing women was.
I had no idea. That's cool.
Better in a lot of ways, and
I think it just gives a better perspective too, or gives a different perspective, I should say. And so, I mean, there's certain things that, different people are going to bring to the table. And so that's why I think it's great too. And the comics are the same way, where, Margit Scott, did a run too, of some of the IDW comics with Tell All Or One and whatnot. And she told her story, which was different than James Roberts' story and all that. And so that's the thing is I think that, it's just good because it's different, it's fresh, it's not going to be the same thing, over and over and over again.
I liked her writing so much better. I really did. I don't like James Roberts'
She's
writing.
A really good writer, as it is, anyway. So, I mean, you can see.
He writes the stuff I like, but he doesn't write it the way I like. It's really hard for me.
Yeah. So, well, I know we're like 20 minutes over our intended
Can you show my last slide, please?
So,
please,
I was going to say we probably
18,
need to wrap up.
Slide 18 is important to me.
Sorry, 18?
Yep, it's the one that butt baby representation is hard for Transformers.
Okay, yep. All right.
Yep, how bad Transformers can be at representation sometimes. That's the point I want to make. So, if you're going to do representation, consult people that actually fit those groups. Actually think about it. Do it for the right reasons, because sometimes you end up with really awkward portrayals. They really pushed the fact that they were going to have a neurodiverse character. Oh, are the images showing up? There they are. Yes.
Yeah.
They really pushed the fact that they were going to have a neurodiverse character. So, what was his name? Geo Modus was supposed to be showing autism spectrum traits. But it was really odd when it came off, just as far as being kind of phoned in a lot of ways. It was still an attempt, though. I think it's an interesting direction to go. But then you have awful things. Yes, we did get a female combiner. The Japanese version was our Megatronia team, and they came with a wonderful bath time art of super sexualizing female robots.
I was not aware of that.
Yeah, no, that image.
I now wish that I wasn't.
Oh no, you're welcome. I try to help.
Appreciate that.
I live to serve and make sure that everybody knows that our fandom is kind of weird, because it was super strange portrayal. I like the weird anime style they go with in the Legends comics and all that stuff. It entertains me, but man, did they do some bad sexualization stuff.
Man.
So yeah, I think this has been a great conversation. I think I've made my point very strongly. Representation does matter, and we're gonna put human groups on our robots. We're going to give them gender. We're going to give them race, because that's how we relate to them. So I think it's just important to do it right when we do decide to do it.
Well, I think the the main thing to take away from the franchise of Robots in Disguise is that they are sentient robots. They are robots that think and feel, to quote More Than Meets the Eye. And the whole point of that is that they have emotion. They love, they hate. They're angry, they're peaceful. So basically, no matter what generation, Transformers effectively are people. They're just not made of meat all the time, I guess, unless it's like Beast Wars or something. But,
yeah, they are people.
So with that, it makes sense since they're going to have personalities, to have a broad spectrum of personalities.
Yep.
Well, I guess on that, Sergio, do you have any other final thoughts before we wrap?
I would definitely like to continue topics like these. These are really interesting topics to talk about, and it's topics that nobody has really talked about. So I think today was a really good conversation, and I hope that a lot of people are taking away some things from it.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, and I think that's something that, as a Transformers fan, it's definitely at the forefront. I think in 2019 that it's something that we're all talking about, and so I think it's important to be able to kind of relate it back to our own fandoms and all that as well. So I've really enjoyed this. I really appreciate, Anna, you coming on and giving us the slides that you've had, and thank you all you guys for coming on and talking about that. And yeah, I completely agree that I'm sure we'll probably have similar topics in the future as well. So, but thank you to everyone for coming in and for commenting as well. And we will see you guys. We also have several other shows on this week. We need to go ahead and publish the schedule, but we should be having Ouch My Wallet again. And then we'll also have Microcasters Tuesday night as well at 10 o'clock Eastern, 9 o'clock Central. So join us there, and I appreciate everyone for your thoughts.
Yeah, and if you like this kind of topic, let us know. If you don't like this kind of topic, that's okay. Just don't say anything. But if you do like this kind of stuff, let us know if we can do it more often or not or whatever. And should we say blah, 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 Patreon, blah, blah? Do we always do that at the end?
Yeah. Antoine,
are we skipping that?
Said that I know other people too have chimed in too about various characters voiced by Black actors like Blaster, Jazz, of course, that we talked earlier, and then Devastator also as well. So, So thanks everyone, and then if you like what we do, again, it's at the bottom of the thing. But we do have a Patreon. If you want to support us as little as $1 a month, that you can support us and help us with our server costs and all that kind of hosting costs for the website and all that type of thing. So anyway, with that, I guess we're out this week, and I appreciate everyone for the great topic and their thoughts. So have a good night.
Bye. See you guys later.